and welcome to Sprinklr's Pride Chat with OutRight Action International, turning insights into action. My name is Tony Vargas. I am the head of workplace at Sprinklr and involved in many employee experience initiatives. My preferred pronouns are he and him. At Sprinklr, we believe in building a culture of belonging, a judgment-free zone where we treat all employees like family, no matter who you are, where you're from, what you believe in, or who you love. We all belong at Sprinklr. In honor of Pride Month, we are having this fireside chat with OutRight Action International, a leading LGBT human rights organization who works at the international, regional, and national levels to research, document, defend, and advance human rights and improve life for LGBTIQ people around the world. Joining us from Sprinklr is Ian Hensley, who built the dashboards and the data that we will be looking at today. Hello, Ian.
Hey, everybody. It's Ian. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm looking forward to showing you some of this Pride data today.
And our very special guest is the Deputy Executive Director of OutRight Action International, Maria Sjödin.
Thank you so much for having me. I love being here. I use they or she for my pronouns.
Amazing. So Maria, tell us a little bit about OutRight Action International and the work that you do around the world.
So OutRight is an organization that has been around for 30 years, fighting for the human rights of LGBTIQ people globally. And this is an incredibly important work. And we've come a long way in those 30 years, but there's still a long way to go. I mean, just as one example, 68 countries still criminalize same-sex relations, which is it's a historical remnant for the most part from the colonial era and colonialization that really exported homophobia worldwide. And it has very real impacts still today.
And what's some of the work that I know OutRight has been doing some work around the impact of COVID on the LGBTIQ community. What have been some of the insights that you found?
So when the pandemic broke out, I mean, we heard about it early and it became real for us early because we have colleagues in Asia. And so we had to rejigger our programming, I think a long time before most people in the US were really realizing what an impact COVID would have. And we realized that the typical situation in crisis, natural disaster or other forms of crisis is that the communities that are the most marginal to begin with under sort of regular circumstances become even more marginalized in a crisis. And in fact, when something like a natural disaster or a pandemic, we think it affects everyone. So there's even less understanding that you might have to take certain measures to reach all parts of the community. So one of the things that we do a lot of is research and data collection. And so we decided to launch a rapid research project right away. And a few weeks ago, we released our report with findings. We interviewed almost 60 people in close to 40 countries about the impact of COVID. And what we heard was quite frightening. We heard about LGBTIQ communities going without food. Many work in the informal economies, and so they lost their income right away. They do not have savings. And so food insecurity was a very real situation for a lot of people. And in fact, we have many examples. With one example is a lesbian couple in the Philippines who went to their local government who was distributing food to families, and they were turned away because the local government wouldn't recognize that they were a family because they were a lesbian couple. And so we heard about similar situations from many parts of the world. Another example, of course, is healthcare. Of course, everyone is worried about healthcare during a pandemic. But we heard about how trans people were told, well, their hormone therapy wasn't considered essential during the pandemic, so they had to go without. We heard about people's access to HIV medication being cut off because they couldn't get to the clinic because during lockdowns, which is something that's been instituted in a lot of countries, you weren't allowed to move freely. There was no public transportation, so they couldn't access their medication. And then we heard from, especially from trans people, one of the people we interviewed is a trans woman in Moscow, and she said only if she was dying would she go to the hospital. She wouldn't go if she didn't know that she was going to die without going, she wouldn't go because she knew they would treat her badly and not recognize her for who she was. So these are just some of the examples that we highlight in the report of how LGBTIQ communities are disproportionately affected during this pandemic and the very real and serious consequences that this has. So the other side of that is that what we didn't just want to research. One of the other things that we do a lot is supporting the global LGBTIQ movement. So we also launched an emergency fund to fundraise and give out small grants to organizations around the world. And so we are hoping really by the end of Pride Month, as we close, that we will be above $1 million raised for our global communities. So those are some of the things that we have done in response to COVID and how we see that the vulnerability that exists under regular circumstances is just enhanced and made worse during the pandemic.
Wow. So it jumps out at me that policy changes are essential because people who work in the informal economy, as you mentioned, are not eligible for government programs like the payroll protection plan that was offered in the United States. And then things like marriage equality will really provide rights for like you said, for the lesbian couple in the Philippines. Now we've seen that over the past couple of years, there's been great advancement of gay rights in the United States at the policy level. But you have been involved with OutRight OutRight has been around for a long time, and you have seen what have been those catalysts for change. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that change doesn't happen automatically. Change comes because organizations and activists push for that change. So like organizing and creating a movement, that to me stands out as the foundation for how you achieve change. When people organize, when they come together, when they say, this isn't right, we shouldn't just be living in our tiny closets, hoping to stay under the radar. We should come together in organizations. We should start demanding, we should start asking to be recognized. I think that is a big driver of change. And over the 15 or so years that I've been involved in international LGBTIQ activism, that is what I've seen. Like I've seen so many more organizations come up in countries, that didn't have organizations to begin with, where the movement is much younger, where there wasn't the Stonewall, 51 years ago, where the movement is much younger and people have more recently started to organize. But the change that has come, even if I just look at these, last 15 years, when I first started doing international work, there were over 90 countries that criminalized same-sex relations. And now it's down to only 68. We still have a long way to go, but we can still see that that change is actually happening. And it is happening everywhere. I mean, we did another research study a couple of years ago where we looked at where organizations can legally register. And we found 30 countries at that time in 2018 where there were no organizations at all. And I feel certain that when we redo this study and look at the same metrics, there will be fewer countries. There will be more countries that have organizations. Whether they are allowed to legally register or not, that's another matter. Many countries, many governments who don't want to recognize our rights, they actually try to stop even the organizing. So in many countries, organizations have to say, they can't say that they're going to work to promote human rights for LGBTIQ people. They have to say that they're an arts organization or a social club or a youth group, or they have to say that they're doing something else so as not to be discovered by their governments. But as soon as a group starts organizing, things can start to change.
And we see how conversations, now that we have, with the advent of modern channels and social media, conversations have really been a driving factor for organizing and for activism. How have you seen the conversations change over the last 15 years in the international arena? Or not over the last 15, I'd say over the last 10, when we're really more active on social.
I mean, I think that social media, it engages people, and it allows everyone to have a voice. And I think that what we see is, I think it's been great working in the global space, because it allows people to connect. And so we're not just, all watching. I'm from Sweden originally. It's like everyone watches American television, and this allows people to see other things and to connect globally in different ways. And of course, I think it sparks a lot of conversations. And overall, I think that is a good thing, because it makes us more connected. It allows us to learn more from each other. What's happening in one country can be used in another country. And so I think that overall, I think that communication is really helping advance the mobilizing that can then lead to change.
And we've seen that, recently with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? The amount of conversation generated on social media around that was really phenomenal.
I mean, I think that's great. And also, I mean, of course, if you only look at the US perspective, of course it's great. But I mean, I love to see, friends and colleagues all over the world talking about Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Because racism is racism is a pandemic. Racism exists everywhere. And we need to say Black Lives Matter everywhere, because racism exists all over the globe. And so we need to have these conversations everywhere in every country. It looks, of course, a little bit different depending on where you are, but the fundamental discussion needs to happen.
I was so encouraged to see that the Black Lives Matter protest in Berlin was so big. I think it was from that one weekend where we saw a lot of them, it was the biggest one, and it was fascinating to see. And as you said, it's great to see that it's happening at the international level and not just locally in the US, because it impacts everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to look at a little data?
Sure.
Yeah, Ian, come on back and show us those dashboards.
For sure.
All right, so we're gonna deep dive into some dashboards, and we have collected data around Pride, LGBTIQ, and with the power of Sprinklr, we pick up all the public conversations. So we're gonna be able to see a lot of the information that is surrounding, that is connected to this. So here we have. Let's start with the sentiment, Maria. We have the sentiment of the conversation right in front of you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you see?
Yeah, I mean, I am not surprised, unfortunately, that the negative outweighs the positive. And I think that a lot of people believe that we are sort of, we have overcome most of the homophobia and transphobia. People are so accepting now. And I think that when you work in this space, and when you talk to a lot of people from different places, you just know that is not the case, that there is still a lot of negative sentiment, unfortunately, around LGBTIQ people in our existence, and the fact that we take up more space and that there is more visibility. So I think that unfortunately, I was not surprised about that. I do want to say that the neutral, without going deeper into it, I do appreciate that the neutral is such a large portion, because I do think that neutral, when it comes to LGBTIQ people and Pride, actually neutral is good, because neutral, I interpret that as meaning it's just a fact. It is a fact that LGBTIQ people exist, and we know that those who want to strip us of our rights, that is actually one of their first claims. They claim that either that we choose to be gay or lesbian, or that trans people don't even exist. So the fact that it can be talked about in neutral terms, I take that as a positive statement, because it means it's just a fact. The weather is nice, LGBTIQ people exist. Right now is Pride Month. Like, all of those things are just facts. So I appreciate the neutral.
But we do want to reduce that red, right? We want to reduce that,
Absolutely.
that percentage of that negative. Ian, tell us a little bit the difference that we see between the percentage and the volume. What is that telling us?
Yeah, so the chart here on the right side of the screen shows the actual amount of volume of messages with identifiable sentiment. So positive, negative, neutral. And then on the left side, we have out of the total volume of conversation, part of a whole. So we have about 20% positive here, which corresponds to 3.2 million messages, and then 35% negative, which is about 5.7 million messages.
And so far, we're looking at data for the month of June of this year, right?
Correct.
So
yeah.
This month of June until, and we're looking at data until Friday the 25th. For the moment. And what's that sentiment on the hashtags down there? Maria, what is what do you see here that stands out to you from this sentiment?
I mean, I think it's interesting to hear that to see that Pride Month and Pride have more positive than negative, but I think, unfortunately, I think we can talk a little bit more about that, how the intersection of Pride and the Black Lives Matter movement. But we see that Black Trans Lives Matter, that has overwhelmingly negative. And unfortunately, I think that reflects the reality for a lot of trans people of color as well. So I think it's reflected in this breakdown.
Yeah, because we see there the percentage of negative is 81.4 for Black Trans Lives Matter. Now let's see how the sentiment is by country. Ian, scroll down a little bit, and maybe there we go, to see where these conversations are happening.
Everywhere, which I think fundamentally is a good thing, even when in many cases the negative might outweigh the positive. I think it's a starting point. These conversations, I mean, they have to happen. People have to understand that LGBTIQ people exist everywhere, and that is how we can start to create this change that, has to happen everywhere.
Nice. Let's take a look at the rest of the sentiment, Ian.
So then we have a breakdown by language as well. So that kind of goes hand in hand with the country. So we can see English has about 18% positive with 34% negative. So that kind of falls right in trend with the overall volume of conversation, because we were about 20, I think 40 on the overall volume. And like Maria was saying, that was because, or my hypothesis is because it's an English query. And then we have the Spanish coming in with about 32% positive. And then on this side, we can see total volume mentions. So around 15 million mentions, pretty much the entire conversation stream was in English. But then we have these kind of other messages down here, Spanish coming in second, followed by Portuguese.
Excellent. Let's take a look at the next widget on sentiment. Your other sentiment widget there, Ian.
So we've had a pretty steady trend from June 1st up until today of no real spikes. However, there was a spike at the beginning of June when the Pride conversation was initially starting around Pride Month. So the green line you see here is the positive, red line is negative, and then the gray is neutral. Maria,
what's your take?
I mean, there's clearly sort of a steady conversation through the month. I think I honestly, I think I would have expected it to take off during the second half a bit more, because personally, I felt that there was so much discussion in the beginning of the month or Black Lives Matter, and not so much the connection to Pride. But clearly, I didn't see everything. So this is actually very helpful to something that picks up everything, not just what I see in my bubble.
Yeah, and I'd say I'm not surprised by this, because I remember from my feed a lot of going into Pride Month, a lot of people saying, you know, we can't talk about Pride without talking about Black Lives Matter, because, you know, the first Pride was a riot. It was the Stonewall riots is what propelled the movement forward, talking about catalysts of change. So I particularly wasn't surprised by this much. Very cool. Let's see what the volume of conversation of Pride has been year over year. Let's go to that year over year sentiment. This is year to month, so year to date now. In 2020, a steady rise, and in May it picks up, and in June, you know, June Pride Month it goes into high speed.
Yeah, and the orange bar here is distinct users. So how many individuals are in the conversation, distinct profiles, and the blue trend line is the volume of messages produced by those users in the conversation. So this is 2020 and then 2019. So this is the full year of 2019 historically. And we see in January pretty much a trend upwards to June, and then kind of a ramp down starting in July all the way through December. January and December have kind of the same amount of messages in the conversation.
So it's in and about 2 million people talking about Pride year round, and then it spikes up to about 5 million in June. Maria, how does that relate to you know, catalyst of change or Pride as a celebration? What does this information tell you about Pride?
I mean, I think Pride Month is important because it really sort of clearly generates a lot of discussion and visibility. But I do think sort of, and also this is sort of my personal philosophy around change, that change doesn't necessarily happen through Pride Month itself. It's like, I think of Pride Month as something that's a happy time and the sort of time for energizing the LGBTIQ community. I think a lot of the actual change happens the rest of the year in the conversations that people have, of course, on social media, but also in their workplaces, with their families, around the kitchen table, like a lot of those things that go on day in and day out. And I think that for me personally, as an activist, I think of Pride Month as a time when I can sort of gather and harness some of that energy that I then use for the rest of the year. And I think that the conversations that people are having the rest of the year are just as important. And so, of course, I guess down the line, what I would like to see is, of course, totally, I want to see a spike during Pride, but I would want to see some of that conversation be a little bit more sustained throughout the year, because just as coming out isn't something that you do once. It's something that you do in a lot of different situations, when you go to the doctor, when you ride in an Uber, or like all of those conversations. And I think I look at this in sort of the same way. It's like this conversation needs to be sustained throughout the year in order for us to achieve the kind of changes that we want to see.
So we have to see the amount of distinct users raise, right? To see not only advocates but allies as well talking about Pride in LGBTIQ community throughout the year, so we can continue offering that visibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is 2018, just for perspective. So about 14.3 million messages in the month of June. For 2019, we had about 17 million. And then to date, we are right at 17.7 for June. So I expect this month, this 2020 Pride to be a little bit bigger by volume of messages.
And that's also what happened last year. Last year was World Pride, right? So there was a lot of more generation, and the fact that even before the last weekend of Pride, we're seeing the same amount of volume of messages. That's super positive because there's nothing particularly about Pride this year that is, that is kind of spiking the conversation, except those overlaps that we spoke about.
Yeah, and I mean, I would have expected Pride this year to be a little bit more muted because we're all quarantining, or like there can't be any big gatherings. So a lot of the manifestations of Pride look very different this year. And I mean, some of the critics of Pride will say, well, Pride, oh, it's just one big party. Why do you have to do it? I mean, actually this year, it's not one big party because no one is going to any big party. So actually, I think that is quite interesting. And I think that the fact that people are talking about it, even without, they're not out, tweeting from the biggest parties, they're sitting at home. And I think that actually, I kind of like that. I think it hopefully reminds us a little bit about our roots and our ability to organize and to create visibility, even when we're not allowed to gather in big groups.
Yeah, so it's not selfies at the parade. This is people at home actually talking about it. That's great. Let's go on to the next dashboard. All right, this next dashboard shows us a couple of more information about the value distribution of what these conversations, the conversations that are happening online. Ian, tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here, and then Maria, give us your insights because this will be fascinating.
Yeah, so this widget right here is grouped by AI entity value. So basically what the computer or / Sprinklr does is it groups all the messages with common, conversation points. So we can see right here that the most talked about one that the computer recognized was Donald Trump, and then followed by George Floyd. So it's just kind of like grouping all the messages together with a common theme. So you can see what the conversation is about and where the conversation is taking you.
And scroll up a little bit so we can see those other person and entity TV distributions. What's underneath there? There we go. No, go down, just to see out the top 3 widgets. There we go. So Maria, go for it. Tell us what you see.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that George Floyd ranks so high on the mentions, and I choose to see that as something positive. We need the movement for racial justice and the fight against homophobia and transphobia. They need to be linked. So just as you said, I mean, the first Pride was a riot and it was a protest against police brutality. I think it's critical to see that these fights have to be interlinked, and you can't just pick and choose and just go for one. I mean, it's not, we can be an LGBTIQ, fight for LGBTIQ rights, or be an ally to LGBTIQ people and be an anti-racist at the same time. We're not choosing just one identity. We have to be in the fight and stand up for a lot of different causes. And right now, I think the fight against racism is so incredibly important. It's unbelievable that in this, to this day, we haven't gotten further. And I think we need to all play our part in that. So I choose to see this as, this is a good thing. And I think hopefully it shows a lot of that sort of common energy that we need to have and that we need to show up for the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's great. That intersectionality just gives me this sense of hope, right? That change is coming, and yeah, then we see a whole plethora there. And COVID-19, although it's at the end, it's also something that people are talking about, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is very special for this moment. I mean, I think of this time as like, is this something that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life? The pandemic, the first pandemic, who knows? But it is a very special experience that we're going through right now, and I think that it does play a big part. And I also want to acknowledge, I mean, we see here the Supreme Court decision from the U.S. Supreme Court from just over a week ago, recognizing that LGBT people have protection from discrimination in the workplace based on federal law. And I think that is an incredibly important landmark decision that, of course, impacts everyone in the US, but because the US has such an outsized importance in the world, hopefully will also have an impact globally. And then I don't know about the drinks. I mean, maybe that's just the pride partying that is actually still taking place. And I choose to see that as a good thing too.
Well, it's interesting because drinks have been a big conversation throughout the pandemic. I'm fascinated by, and I want to move on to other things, but I'm fascinated by SpongeBob SquarePants. The creator had originally said that SpongeBob SquarePants was asexual, and then Nickelodeon this year kind of dressed them up in rainbow colors, and what that does for visibility for kids and for millennials who grew up watching it is amazing.
I mean, I love that, and I think it is so important. I mean, it is so important to have role models. It's so important to have visibility. And coming back to what I said a little bit before about like the neutral thing, it's like, of course, it's an amazing thing to see a rainbow dressed up SpongeBob. And of course, I mean, I want kids to see that too. I want kids to see that, anyone can dress up in a rainbow, anyone can be LGBTIQ or an ally, and that's great. It's something we should celebrate. So I mean, I love to see that.
Beautiful. Let's scroll down a little bit, Ian, see what else we see on here. So in that entity political distribution, obviously at the bottom right, the Supreme Court decision, as you mentioned, a big part of the conversation. Congress, a big part of the conversation, and then we move to the United Nations. Now, you guys work closely with the United Nations. What do you see here?
Yeah, I'm very happy to see the United Nations on here. OutRight has what's called special consultative status at the United Nations. And what it means is that we as an organization can have access to the United Nations. We can participate in conferences. We go there a lot to talk to the governments and to advocate for the recognition of LGBTIQ people and our human rights. And especially in countries where LGBTIQ people don't have access to their own governments, or they're ignored, or their existence is criminalized. It is incredibly important to have the United Nations as a place to take your call for justice. And so that is why we do a lot of this work. We ensure that we bring activists from around the world to talk to the governments that sit at the United Nations and demand our rights. And so it's an incredibly important place to be able to go and to call for the protection of us and our lives and for the recognition of our human rights. Because human rights, they should be for everyone. And that includes LGBTIQ people. We're not asking for special rights. We're asking for the same human rights as everyone else, but they're not granted to us in too many places. So the United Nations is a great place for us to be able to go and to take that conversation and to see that conversation is actually happening. I'm encouraged by that.
So there you go, allies and advocates. Mention the United Nations and does increase in the increased conversations. Let's drill into the George Floyd topic cluster because it speaks about the intersectionality of allyship and advocacy. Now, we throughout the past 2 centuries, the one we're living now and before, we've seen the women's rights movement. We've seen the civil rights movement in the 60s and early 70s, the gay rights movement in the 90s just kind of, move forward, and in the 2000s with great policy, and Black Lives Matter just right now. And we see that these are conversations happening about pride and has these values in them. So again, we see that we continue to fight for equality as advocates, as allies, and as people who are part of the community.
I think this is very important. It's very important to see these things come together, and also to know that Black trans people, other trans people of color face a lot more violence than other parts of the LGBTIQ community, including in the US. So it is incredibly important to see these conversations come together. And we all LGBTIQ people and our allies, we have to recognize we're also allies in other movements. So we have to stand up, we have to speak out, we have to take part in that.
Yeah, because as one of our colleagues mentioned yesterday or this week in a panel, when as a family, when something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. So this is not something that's happening to some people. This is happening to the world that we live in, right? And it's important that we all become allies. So you know what? Let's talk about allyship and advocacy and how we can turn these insights into action. Ian, thank you so much for sharing these dashboards. Let's see that last widget that you had called General real quick before we move into you know what we can do to do this. And you had mentioned before that Twitter retweets are really important because it amplifies the conversation, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I think it kind of speaks to the virality of a movement. So one message can start, you know, an entire social movement on modern channels. And we can see that right here with the Twitter retweets. So
again, conversation and being a part of the conversation and staying in it. Ian, thank you for these dashboards. That is amazing. This is incredible work. The power of Sprinklr is incredible. So Maria, let's talk a little bit about, we have all these insights. What can we do? You know, we have as I mentioned, we have a culture of belonging at Sprinklr, and we're strong believers in allyship, right? It's not just the person who is a part of the community, but everybody else who is a part of that family, of that community. So what are some things that we can do at an individual level to increase that conversation, to be a catalyst for change in those areas where we have seen through the data?
I mean, I think that, the number one thing is be part of that conversation. So whether you're an ally or you identify as an LGBTIQ person yourself, be part of those conversations and initiate them. And it's not just a one time, it's not just once a year during Pride Month. These conversations need to happen throughout the year. And I think someone told me that they think of ally, ally is not something that you are, ally is something that you do. And I think of that as incredibly important. You need to show up and you need to be visible. And if you're not visible, other people, you may feel like, oh, I'm such a great ally. This is so important. Of course, I think everyone should be treated the same. But if you don't articulate it, if you don't say it, if you're not, if you're on social media all the time, but you never say anything about being an ally, other people are not going to know about it. And so I think that's an important call to action, like be an ally, be a visible ally. So that is, of course, one thing you can do. You can also get involved in an organization. I was talking to people last night who want to be volunteers and volunteer with OutRight. There are many ways that you can get involved beyond speaking out. I think that's great. Obviously, we're nonprofit. Obviously, people can donate to OutRight, support, or help host a house party or something like that. I think there are many different ways of being engaged, and I think that is my number one call to action. Like, do engage, be visible, and do it during Pride Month, but do it during the rest of the year too, because it takes more than 1 month a year to create the change that we want to see in the world.
It's not just 1 month of rainbows. and for our international Sprinklerites and customers and audience that are watching, if they wanted to support something locally, can they reach out to OutRight to find what are those organizations that they can get involved with directly?
Yeah, for the most part, they probably could. After 30 years, we have a lot of partnerships in a lot of different countries. So we actually counted yesterday, and we saw that over the last 10 years, we have either directly worked in the countries or been engaged with 91 countries. So it does speak to, and we probably have contacts in even more countries. So yeah, absolutely.
So individually, speak up, get involved. At a community level, what are some of the things that we can do as a community? So, you know, at Sprinklr, we're consider ourselves a family. We all have circles of friends. You know, what are some of the things that we can do at the community level to be a catalyst for change?
I mean, I think basically, I think it comes back to the same things. I mean, I think corporations should also be visible and speak out and take a visible stand around these issues. And I think that's to me, on the community level, is equally important to do that, and to also to know that we need the community to sustain this movement. It can't just be, you know, one or two people at a company who are, you know, the pride leads or whatever, and they have to do all the work. Like, everyone needs to show up and everyone needs to participate. So I think for me, that's the meaning of community, that you have to come together, you have to show up.
And in a time like now, there was something that you said, like, we're currently all working from home at Sprinklr, and we have offices in many parts of the world. So some of our Sprinklerites that might be safe in the office might not be as safe in the community, right? So we need to be aware of what is happening outside of our circle to understand how we can be supportive to all the members of our community.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one thing that stood out in our COVID research. How many people are, of course, everyone's isolated at home, and many people have had to maybe go back to their original biological families where they're not necessarily always accepted. So, I mean, this thing about coming out, it's something that you do in certain situations. You may or may not be out in all situations. And for some people, the family is not the safest place to be. So I think recognizing that and seeing that those are things that impact people and our colleagues as well, it's incredibly important to be aware of that.
And how about at the corporate level? We see a lot of brands and marketing efforts kind of, you know, turn their logos and have representation in the parades when we have them again, and do a lot of initiatives around Pride. What's the importance of that?
I mean, I do think it is very important, because corporations, I mean, they shape the world, and there's a lot of money in advertising. We all see it. It's part of the public space. So of course, I think all of those things are important. But what I do think is that as LGBTIQ communities and our allies, I mean, we know when someone is just doing it for show, when they, you know, smack a rainbow onto something, and when it really reflects their values. And so I do think it is incredibly important for corporations to realize that they have to live their values, you know, the other 11 months as well. And I do think that corporations that, you know, if you try to sell something with a rainbow, you should make sure that some of that goes back to LGBTIQ communities as well. It's not just something that you put on for show. And I think also what I think has been encouraging now is also seeing more corporations take a stance for Black Lives Matter, to realize that these things are interlinked. Like, you can't just pick and choose, you know, what groups you want to give rights to. And I think that is something, living the values, I think, is something that all corporations have to do.
And as you mentioned, not just in the way of changing your logo or anything like that, but really taking into action.
Yeah, I think it has to be seen as something you do internally within your company. And of course, I want to see corporations communicate that externally in, you know, sensitive ways, depending on the context. But corporations also have a lot of influence with governments. So not everything is about, oh, this is what we're doing publicly, look at us, we're doing great things. It can also be weighing in and using contacts to speak to governments using silent diplomacy, basically, and using the influence that they have.
And we have seen loyalty, right, to brands that really take action and that really live out those values.
Yeah.
Maria, this has been fascinating. My gosh, I could go on forever, but obviously we can't. So what are some final thoughts that you want to share with our community about, you know, turning insights into action and being catalysts for change, and how they can get involved?
I really want to encourage people to get involved and to stay involved, and to make it not just about Pride Month, but to make it something that happens year round. And I want working for a global organization and really believing that we have to see the whole world change. It's not just something that happens locally or in our country. I want to encourage people to be more globally minded, to follow, to learn about what's happening around the world, and to be an active global citizen. Incredible.
So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Ian, for the amazing dashboards that gave us all these insights. We heard it. We have to get involved. Being a silent ally is not enough. The fight for equal rights for everybody extends across the gamut of race, gender identity, everywhere. We are very lucky that Sprinklr is committed to building that culture of belonging, where it's a judgment-free zone for everybody to show up just as they are. Maria Sjödin, OutRight Action International. We'll share all the links where you can get involved. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.